The man's eyes, heavy with a grotesque, eager expectation, slid over her chest before crawling lower. He stared for an agonizingly long time, his gaze tracing the outlines of her body through the thin, treacherous silk of her dress. Finally, he looked back up, his eyes locking onto hers. Talia felt her entire body turn to stone. She knew she had to run, knew she had to scream, but her legs refused to move. Her throat felt as though it had been filled with lead. The monk, licking his parched lips, stepped into her space. "If you would only permit it, Your Highness." "I could." A rough, calloused hand reached out and touched the hair spilling over her shoulder. Talia watched in a paralysis of horror as his gnarled fingers tangled themselves into the golden strands. It became impossible to breathe. She should have shrieked, she should have struck him for the audacity of touching an imperial princess. But no sound came from her parted lips. Taking her silence for a form of consent, the monk's fingers moved from her hair to her face. His skin, as rough as coarse sandpaper, burned against her cheek. Talia drew her head back in a spasm of revulsion, and then, a hand clad in a silver plate gauntlet erupted from the shadows. It seized the monk's wrist in a bone-crushing grip. Talia snapped out of her trance and lunged away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up and found herself staring into a pair of cold, silver-blue eyes. Varkas. Her heart sank. She instinctively pressed her back against the cold stone wall. Varkas, his face a mask of unyielding stone, slowly turned his head toward the monk. Whatever the man saw in that gaze, it was enough to make him shiver as if he'd been struck by a sudden, violent fever. He began to shake uncontrollably. I just. Her Highness was. I mean. He stammered, the words dissolving into a pathetic whimper. Enough. Varkas's voice was a low, heavy vibration that cut through the monk's excuses like a blade. The man's face went white, his features twisting in agony. Varkas seemed to be holding him effortlessly, and yet the sheer force in that grip threatened to shatter bone. "None of us desire any unnecessary complications," Varkas said, his voice slow and lethal as he stared into the man's eyes. "Return to your quarters. Now." Calmly. The monk, writhing in the commander's hold, nodded frantically. Varkas released him with a flick of his wrist. "And as long as we remain here," he added, his tone dropping to a sub-zero temperature, "ensure you stay far from my sight." "Why yes, of course." The monk sobbed, clutching his rapidly swelling wrist as he scrambled away into the darkness. Varkas watched him vanish before turning his gaze to Talia. She immediately looked down. Though she had done nothing wrong, her throat felt parched, and a hot, shameful flush crept up her neck. She couldn't find her voice, couldn't find a way to navigate the silence until his voice, disgustingly calm, shattered it. "Let's go. I will see you to your quarters." The tension that had held her rigid finally snapped, leaving her body limp and trembling. In its place came a sharp, jagged surge of humiliation and resentment. I was so terrified. And you? How can you be so calm? She bit her lip, unable to voice the storm of emotions in her chest. She marched past him, determined to hide her shaking hands. She would rather die than allow him to see her weakness. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and moved through the corridors with a desperate, hollow dignity. Minutes later, the building reserved for the female novices loomed ahead. Talia spoke over her shoulder, her voice thick with a manufactured gloom. "We're here. You can stop following me now." Knights were stationed around the perimeter, there would be no repeat of the night's horror here. Talia hurried toward the entrance, but she hadn't taken 3 steps when she found herself pinned between the wall and Varkas's broad form. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. What are you doing?" "Why, if you continue to play with fire, you will eventually be consumed by it." His voice was hoarse, a jagged edge to it that she hadn't heard in years. He seemed to realize it himself, falling silent for a heartbeat. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its terrifying, level composure. "Is it not time you learned the value of caution?" The blood drained from Talia's face. Varkas studied her with a gaze that felt like a needle under the skin. He offered a short, bitter smile. "Or do you truly not care to whom you surrender yourself?" Before she could think, Talia's hand flew up. But this time, he caught her wrist before her palm could connect with his face. "If that is indeed the case," Varkas said, his voice dropping to a low murmur, "kindly refrain from such indulgences until this journey is over. I do not wish to deal with any more of your problems." Talia pressed her trembling lips together. He released her hand and turned away with a slow, deliberate indifference. "I trust one have made myself clear." In that moment, if she'd had a dagger in her hand, she would have driven it into his back without a second thought. She stared after him with a cold, predatory determination. But then her vision began to blur, and she whirled around, fleeing into the building. She knew he wouldn't look back, but she was still paralyzed by the fear that he might see her tears. She wiped her eyes roughly with her sleeve and vanished inside. The following morning, the ceremonies proceeded as if the previous night's nightmare had never happened. Talia sat on the stone windowsill of her room, looking down as Gareth and Ayla approached the altar. Behind them, as always, stood Varkas. Talia had been expected to attend, but she had refused, citing a sudden illness. It was an act of staggering audacity for a member of the Imperial family to skip such a mandatory ritual. The ceremony should have been delayed, but at Gareth's insistence, it went ahead as planned. Perhaps the monks were relieved, who, after all, wanted to offer a blessing to a bastard? "Perhaps I should have gone," she murmured, but the smirk died on her lips as her eyes found Ayla and Varkas standing together before the altar. If she had been there, she didn't know what she would have done. She might have screamed. She might have lunged at one of them. She might have even killed. Which of them do I hate more? I truly don't know anymore. She raised her hand to her lips out of habit, then lowered it. She didn't want to ruin her manicure. She couldn't bear to watch any longer. Talia yanked the curtains shut and threw herself onto the bed. In the darkness, she curled into a tight ball. The events of the night before replayed in her mind like a fever dream. The monk's lecherous gaze, his reaching hands. And Varkas's icy, condemning eyes. If you continue to play with fire. Is it not time you learned the value of caution? She pulled the heavy blanket over her head. Varkas believed she had invited that man's touch. He believed she was exactly the girl the rumors said she was. And maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. She was always acting out, always driving herself into corners. And his role had always been to drag her out of the wreckage. He had only just escaped that burden, and here she was, forcing it back upon him. Of course he was revolted. Of course he was tired of her. Talia buried her face in the pillow and let out a quiet, jagged giggle. The memory of the day he had left her life flashed before her eyes. It seemed everything lately was a reminder of that final, agonizing break. She stared at the sliver of light piercing the curtains until the memories of the past began to surface, unbidden and overwhelming.